Shame is a very powerful emotion that truly paralyzes you, that stops you from doing things, that stops you from aspiring, that stops you from trying. The hostility that you feel, one of the purposes is to make you feel ashamed and to hinder you, to make sure you don't fight back.
Hi, I'm Isabelle Rogol, and this is Borderline. When Marcela Kunova raised her hand to be interviewed for the Border Life series, exploring the experiences and identities of global citizens, I asked her if she had any themes in mind, a red thread through her life that could guide our conversation. Well, she said, "Have you thought about shame?" No, I hadn't, and what ensued was a profound and deeply personal conversation that raised a lot of things for me about the weight that immigrants carry, about how xenophobia is internalized and can hinder us, but also how we can rise nonetheless and fight the shame that others might put on us. Marcela is Slovak. She's the editor of journalism.co.uk. After a life journey that saw her travel from a Soviet republic to the Far East and back to the European Union. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Marcela.
I was born in Slovakia. Well, I was born in Czechoslovakia at the time, and I was born in family with my mom, who was from Slovakia, and my dad, who was from Czech Republic. So from day one, I learned to speak both languages, which in a federal republic, usually people can kind of understand each other's language, but they will rarely be able to speak. And I suppose this opened up horizons. I just realized that there is not just one country in the world or one language in the world. I think from when I was a child, being bilingual or, the knowledge that the world is bigger than one country was just normal to me. So I suppose it all kind of started there.
So you didn't stop there. Where else did you live around the world?
So when I was 18, I went to Japan. Now, I never really necessarily planned it. I found a job. So I lived there for 6 months, and the kind of plan was, work for 6 months, come back, earn enough money, and go to university. And that kind of didn't materialize because from Japan, I went to Italy. And instead of going to university, I did vocational studies. And after 3 years, I left for France. Lived there for 7 years. And then I left for the UK. And here I am.
And you never went home in between?
I actually didn't. No. I mean, apart from, visit or holidays, I have never returned to Slovakia, no.
What made you go from, maybe I'll go to Japan, to I'll spend my entire life living outside of my country?
I know, right? I think the fact that I never planned made that nothing really happened. In a sense, I didn't plan to stay away or I didn't plan to return. And because there was no plan, I was just taking it one step at a time. When I went to Japan, I needed a job. It was the very short story of those times. The unemployment was extremely high. There was absolutely no way I could find work in Slovakia, certainly not as an 18-year-old.
When was this? What year?
That was 2001. I mean, when I was young, there was no such thing as, fast foods or McDonald's where students would get a job. There just weren't these possibilities. You had work or nothing. You were not doing sort of student jobs. So I could never probably earn enough money to go to university. I come from very poor background. I'm not going to use any euphemism there. My parents couldn't support me. My sister was studying already, and I could either work or work somewhere else and try to earn more money than what I could earn in my home country. And so there was this job, and I said, 6 months, I can do that, come back and study. And then it just never happened. I was pushing it and pushing it forward, and then one day it didn't happen for 20 years, and I never gone back.
It's interesting. I think looking back, people are always tempted to put a very coherent narrative on things. But often when you're in the middle of it, it's just what's available right now, looking a month ahead or 2 months ahead. But you rarely really plan a life, do you?
No. I suppose what makes the biggest difference is that I never really felt I have anywhere to go back to. I didn't have a very good relationship with my family. Going back would mean start again. So I could as well just start again somewhere else, apart from being a citizen of a country and being able to speak language, which is not negligible, but I never felt like I had, those roots where I can go back, or this safe harbor where I can go back. For me, I could have gone to Slovakia, but it would not have been going back or going home. It never really felt that way.
Mm. So how did it feel being abroad as a young Czechoslovakian in countries where I assume you didn't speak the language, in Japan or in Italy? Or
no, or in France.
Or in France? So how does that work?
When I was 18, I was completely unequipped to deal with what was going on around me. I've been always a tinkerer. I've been always like, I can do that. If I try hard enough, I can do anything. And I've learned Japanese. Well, I've learned Japanese. I was able to have a conversation in Japanese within a couple of months. I could get by. I was working at a karaoke, which it's not like you need the most rich and profound conversations to have with people. So I could get by, and I was working with a fellow Slovakian, so I wasn't completely isolated. I mean, there was someone I could speak to, but that felt temporary. I just thought 6 months is long, but it's not forever, so I can deal with that. When I came to Italy, I really wanted to stay there. I needed to go somewhere. Going back to Slovakia was not really an option at the time. And I just tried really hard. I went to language school. I obviously needed a visa. But at that time, so that was 2002, I don't know how much you know about Italian politics, but there was really a time where Lega Nord, so the Italian far-right party, was really gaining power, especially in northern Italy. And the anti-immigration rhetorics and the anti-immigration sentiment was really strong. One anecdote that really illustrates it was when I decided to become a beautician, because I didn't have any better idea of what to do with my life. So I went to this beautician school. The fee, I still remember, was 2,000 euros a year. And I obviously needed visa. So I went to the school and I said, is there any possibility to pay a deposit in case I don't get a visa? So I don't lose £2,000. And the secretary kind of looked me up and down, making absolutely sure that I sensed that gaze, and said, well, it's not possible. I asked why. And she said, well, clearly what you want is a visa, and then God knows what you're going to do with it, implying obviously I was a prostitute, because I was clearly Eastern European and blonde and young, so what else could I possibly want in my life than being a prostitute and not study at a school? And the resolution of that was even more humiliating that the then boyfriend came with me to the school, confirming that I am his girlfriend and not a prostitute, and therefore that validated it basically. An Italian said, I'm his property in a strange way. Then I was allowed to pay a deposit and apply for visa, and then I got it and I could study. But just the constant suspicion, or how do I say, not only make you feel you don't belong, just make you feel like you should be someone else, or you should never aspire to be who you are not meant to be, kind of. That was really tough. I mean, that eventually made me leave after 3 years.
Wow. Tell me a bit more about that. When you said it makes you feel like you shouldn't be who you are, how does that play with your sense of identity, which is already complex when you live in a bunch of different countries, as you did? I mean,
listen, being young, being in your early 20s, as tough as it is. Lots of people struggle with their identity and who they are when they belong. So when you form this identity in a place where where you genuinely do not belong, by the fact that you don't know the language, you don't know really anyone there, that obviously doesn't make it any easier. But I think one of the things that I've learned very quickly was to feel shame. I think it's something that is really important to talk about, especially when people are foreigners, because shame is something that gets put on you in a way. You are made feel unworthy or inadequate, or you can't do something because you are not good enough to do it. And I internalized it because I did not know any Slovakian, or not even any foreigner for that matter. I lived in a very small town, so I was really sticking out. And at the time, I didn't have words or concepts to think about how someone is making me feel. I genuinely believed I was not good enough, or I have to try twice as hard to get half the recognition, or I probably deserve to be treated this way because I am trying to, live a life that doesn't belong to me. I don't belong to this place. And, it took me years to understand that I don't have to accept this, or there is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. But, shame is a very powerful emotion that truly paralyzes you, that stops you from doing things, that stops you from aspiring, that stops you from trying. It can be something as little as, because you feel shame for your accent, you will not correct a waiter if they get your order wrong in a restaurant and it's something you hate because you don't want to speak up. I didn't understand it at the time. I understand it now with hindsight. This hostility, when you talk about sort of far right and racism, the hostility that you feel, one of the purposes is to make you feel ashamed and to hinder you, to make sure you don't act or you don't aspire or you don't fight back.
You just made me realize something, which is back in journalism school, in the US, I didn't go into radio because I was very self-conscious about my accent. So I've always loved radio. It's always been my primary medium. I've always wanted to do podcasting and all that, but I didn't until this year. A lot of it was shame, which I didn't realize until now. Wow, you just blew my mind.
And so many foreign, and it can go to different degrees. And obviously, shame, it's a universal human emotion. It's really, really important that we have this conversation because shame is linked to vulnerability. And, vulnerability is never good, right? Because it's equal with weakness. But that's not it. And I know so many foreigners or people who just go to a different country who suddenly freeze. You function at 10% of who you are because you are just ashamed to open your mouth and speak with an accent because of the fear of being judged or maybe being laughed at or being just told you are somehow not good enough, your accent is not good enough, you don't belong. And this fear of not belonging or need to belong is one of the fundamental human instincts. When someone tells you, you don't belong here, you don't have the tribe, you're not going to be accepted and protected, that is extremely scary. If you're in a place where you don't know anyone or where you do not belong and you try to belong, I do understand why many foreigners genuinely do feel paralyzed to a certain degree by the shame of being who they are or to speak up or to just appear foreign or sound foreign because you do get pushback.
How much of that do you think is imposed from the outside, people telling you don't belong here? And obviously the Northern League is the most obvious in your face expression of that. And how much of it is just internalized from all the insecurities that you usually feel, especially in your early 20s?
Absolutely. So, shame is you do need to learn to accept what people are telling you. So someone who's talking much better about shame than me is an American researcher called Brené Brown. And I urge all your listeners to look up her TED Talk on shame. One of the things you need to learn is to care about what other people say. And then you do. Whoever says, oh, I don't care, is probably not perfectly honest. But one thing that I've learned to deal with the feeling of shame is that you realize that you don't have to take what someone wants to give you. Someone says you are not good enough because you can't pronounce R, or because you don't sound good enough, you can't be on the radio. You don't have to accept that. You can say, oh, I'm a great presenter and I really love this show, and my French accent is actually really cute. You don't have to accept what you hear. But to arrive there, you need to have some degree of sense of self-worth, and you need support. I don't think anyone can just do it on their own. You need to have some kind of root, some kind of base where you can draw this strength from and push back. And I think many people, when they go abroad, this support network weakens. Family and friends are far away. They are not, so much part of your everyday life, even with all the technology and WhatsApp and Skype and whatnot. You don't feel that safe. And when you don't feel safe, you fight or freeze. I think it's really important for people to know that they don't have to accept it, but to arrive there, you need to have some sort of strength.
Where did you draw yours from?
My strength?
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the short answer to this would be therapy, where I, for different reasons, finally decided I need to just sort my head out. And that's where I learned loads of these things. My whole life, I just wanted to do things. I wanted to be a journalist and I wanted to study. I graduated with distinction, despite the fact that I barely spoke the language. And I am a very determined person. I have always been a very determined person. I think that it's my character trait. I had to build lots of resilience when I was a kid, and there's probably feistiness is part of my character. So sometimes when I get really, really pushed around, I get very, very angry and I fight back. And I suppose that kind of kept me going.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you would have to. No, but you'd have. I mean, to do the things you did without necessarily a lot of family support, you would need to have that strength. I love that you talk about therapy, because I think mental health comes with so much stigma, and I think especially in immigrant communities, it's harder to talk about, or it's less talked about.
But I think one thing where there is a conversation happening around sort of mental health, there is another conversation happening about sort of innovation and change and resilience, and I think we somehow don't link the two. Being vulnerable, to me, is the condition of innovation or change. You need to admit anything can happen. I'm not safe, and yet I try, and yet I act, and yet I do something. This vulnerability is the fundamental condition of actually doing something, making a change, or do something that has never been done before. And I really would like to normalize this conversation around just vulnerability. When you're a foreigner in a foreign country, you are more vulnerable. It's just a fact. You don't have a support network. You don't really know how the system works. You have to work it out. If something happens to you, you might not have a safety net. You are objectively more vulnerable than if you were back in your country. And sometimes this vulnerability also just gives you the opportunity to be creative and to do things, to try something new, to turn your life around, or to create something at work or in your personal life. And it can be a fantastic source of strength and of inspiration.
But of course, it's the great irony that because of all these extra difficulties, when you're an immigrant, you put the walls up, right? Because, there is that aggression that's coming from the outside, and because you might be a little lost in a new place, you put the walls up as a defense mechanism, which, is the opposite of what you're talking about, which is, leaving space and leaving a door open for change and for personal innovation.
I think putting some defense up is probably a good idea, because when you feel vulnerable, you need to do something to make you feel safe. And then you can draw the strength from there. when you grow. It's a bit like when you're a little plant and you grow in a little glass house. You first need to grow a little bit to be able to be planted outside. So I think it's probably necessary to put certain degree of defense mechanism in place initially until you feel strong enough to come out of that shell and then go for it. Where it starts to be a problem is when you just remain in that shell because shame keeps you there and you still don't feel worthy enough to, Isabel, go out and have your radio show or have your podcast or be in front of the camera, and when it actually hinders who you could be and who you aspire to be.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this conversation with Marcela. Don't go away, just a quick message from your host. I need 11 more patrons just to keep the lights on Borderline. That's not for my time, it's just to cover the basic software cost of producing the podcast, transcripts, editing, website, etc. I need 11 people to pledge £5 a month, and my goal is to find them by Christmas. So if you want to help me end this awful year on a good note and keep Borderline going into 2021, please go to borderlinepod.com or look for Borderline on Patreon and become a member. All it is a pledge of £5 a month. That's a nice latte these days. You can also pay in euros or in dollars, so don't worry about nasty bank fees. You'll get every episode early, more content, access to live events, and join a growing community of global citizens. And you'll make me very happy for Christmas. In fact, to those next 11 members, I'll definitely be sending a Christmas card with some swag, maybe a care package, maybe I'll bake. Who knows? For 11 people, there's a lot I can do. So be one of those early ones. Go to borderlinepod.com or look for Borderline on Patreon. And thank you so much for listening and for helping me do this. I think you hit on something that's interesting, which is that all these things that happen to you when you're a new immigrant, they often happen to you when you're young as well, because most immigrants, it's a decision they usually make earlier in life. You have a lot of fewer middle-aged new immigrants because it's just a different time in life. So you're doing things that require a huge amount of maturity while you're not very mature yet because you're 20 years old. And those two things collide for a lot of people, I think.
Oh, God, yes. And I always say I never, ever want to be 20 again in my entire life. It's hard because, you are meant to act like an adult, which you technically are, but then you are not. And, I suppose even just knowing a language of a country where you go is a massive help. It wasn't a case for me. And when your vocabulary is 400 words, and you just can't express what you're trying to express. It's almost like when you're a toddler, and you have the emotion and you don't have words to express it and you throw a tantrum because you just don't have any better way to express them. And I wasn't throwing many tantrums, not that I remember. But, it emotionally gets really tough to have ideas, to have very clear idea of what you want to say, but not have the vocabulary to actually express it or not having the concept to express it. Again, that kind of shame comes in there because this is what I can ask for, this is what I need, but I can't, I'm not able to, I'm not capable of. And then you start to scale back on what you need or what you can ask for because you just, practically cannot put it in words. When you're building your life, your career or studies or relationships, that initial phase of being able to understand and also be understood is extremely important.
I'm curious then why, after you had finally mastered that in Italy, you moved to France where you had to start all over again. Are you a sucker for punishment? Why?
Yeah, put like that. No, the simple truth is that I had to leave Italy, where the situation became, for me, untenable, personally and professionally as well. And I met someone, simple as that, and I moved to France with him. So I followed love. I moved to France, and I moved to Alsace, to be more precise. I took some time to heal, I suppose. I took about 3 or 4 months where I just needed to breathe and get over everything that happened in the last few months in Italy. And I took this time to learn French, which, as you know, Isabel, is a very complicated language. especially pronunciation-wise. So, talk about being self-conscious. But, within, what was it, 5 months, 6 months, I went and applied for a job. And I finally went to university age 23. By the time when my sort of schoolmates from high school were finishing their masters, I only started the first year. And it was all worth it.
You're in the UK now.
Yes.
How long have you been here?
Since 2011, so 9 years.
Okay, so that's your longest.
That is my longest
stay.
streak, yeah.
Is it home now? Is this for good? Do you think you're going to be traipsing around the world again? Or how do you feel about the future?
You know what? I genuinely hope not. I had my fair share of starting over, and it should get easier every time, but I think it got more difficult every time. Especially when I got to the UK. I just felt, again. It's wearing. It's tiring. So unless anything happens, I hope this is it. I bought a house, I'm married, I have a dog. I like this country. And one thing that really changed for me, and circling back to this sort of behavior or, feeling of vulnerability or shame, despite everything that people say, UK is a much more tolerant country on the whole than any place I've ever been. Not like there are not racist or there are not people who are xenophobic, but at least it is socially unacceptable. Whereas in places where I lived, you could openly belittle or threaten a foreigner. It would be encouraged. Making someone feel like they don't belong or that they are potentially in danger was encouraged. It was seen as, sort of sign of patriotism. And in the UK, at least to a certain degree, I think people managed to suppress that and to genuinely promote tolerance as a value. And I never felt as welcome in any country as I felt here.
That's interesting. I think we have a very different experience of the UK.
I suppose it very much depends where you're from. There is definitely a thing like sort of international hierarchy of countries where you can be, and varies from cool to embarrassing.
Well, I would think that as an Eastern European, you would have a harder time than I do because of all the bad cliches that have come with Brexit. But I think for me, the UK is the first place that I feel like I've really been made to feel like an immigrant. And I think it's probably because I arrived right after the Brexit referendum, and then there's just a political discourse. At the same time, agree with you. I have found London to be extremely welcoming. I've found the journalism community to be extremely welcoming, more than even in my own country. Like in Paris, I always felt like an outsider. And so that's been really lovely. And kind of like you, the more into my late 30s I go, the less I want to pack everything up again and start over, because I've done that 5 times. I'm over it. But the politics are the ugliest politic that I've had to experience. But then again, I wasn't in Italy with the Northern League, so.
But you do you do point something really important, and that is that since the Brexit referendum, things are changing, and I think people are more on the edge, and the sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric is definitely growing, and I'm not even sure people entirely understand it. There are concepts that become commonplace, or they just become accepted, or foreigners or Europeans, I don't know, stealing jobs or whatever. And, it's something that would be, laughed at before the referendum. Now it became this sort of universally accepted truth that no one, but the few people really challenge. And that climate of hostility is becoming a little bit more normalized. So I do partially feel it.
Yeah, I think for me it's oddly made me a bit more aware that I am part of the whole immigrant experience. By that I mean, as a a white woman on an EU passport, I'm incredibly privileged when I travel around the world, and I never really have to ask myself many questions about where am I allowed to go and where will I be accepted and things like that. And suddenly, with the whole Brexit discourse, it's like, oh, right, I am an immigrant, actually. And it's jolted me, shook me out of this complacency and this selfish attitude in a way. It's pushed me to think about the whole immigrant experience and the whole of immigrants as a group that should be in solidarity, even if we all have extremely different experiences. I think it's woken me up a little bit.
100%. And, I lived outside of European Union. I went through visas and permits to stay and permits to work and permits to do whatever. And how many times I traveled through the border and were controlled by armed police. I have that experience, and I think people underestimate how much things can change after Brexit. It's not because UK was part of the European Union that it will forever be accepted. And I think what worries me the most is that hostility very often gets mirrored. When you get hostile towards a community or country or state, it very often comes back. And I don't want to see that happen. I don't want to queue at any border anymore and having my fingerprints being taken just in case. All these experiences are humiliating, not because you should be ashamed, but because you might feel like you don't belong or you're potentially not good enough.
Yeah. I had that experience for the last time I entered the UK. And it was pretty traumatic. A border patrol woman, border force, whatever they call it here, who stopped my car and asked me like 4 times, where are you going? Where are you going? I was like, I'm going home. Here I am driving a British car. Here's my British driver's license. Here's my EU passport, which gives me freedom of movement still, at least until the end of the year. But it was extremely aggressive. And I'm afraid that that's going to become more common.
And when you go and register your stay in a country and your picture gets taken like a mugshot, and then your 10 fingerprints get taken. And there was in Italy, and I asked, well, why are you taking people's fingerprints? And police just look at me and say, well, for the future.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that sets the tone.
Yeah.
So, it all adds up. All these, I'm not talking microaggression. I'm talking about practical obstacles to make you feel like you are safe or you are okay to be somewhere. So, yeah, I very much hope we are not going to see that. But from very practical experience and from just seeing what's going on around the world, things might get more hostile. At least that's what I'm preparing myself for.
Do you think that all these attitudes are kind of like weaponizing the sense of shame? I'm wondering if it's done with the knowledge that it will discourage people from settling here or staying here because of that sense of shame, or if it's just, maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe it's just basic human aggression. I don't know.
The interesting thing about shame is that it is correlated with violence, with destruction, but also with eating disorders, depression, or self-harm. Unlike guilt, guilt is when you do something wrong and you make a mistake and then you feel you've done something that is not in line with your values and you feel guilty. They will correct your behavior. It will try not to do something so you don't feel guilty. Shame is not I made a mistake. It's I am a mistake. It's not I've done something wrong. It is I am wrong. So this shame, when you internalize it, it might very well contribute to self-harming, but it might also contribute to violence, where people who are ashamed will want to push back or fight. So this is where my biggest fear is, where communities feel like they have been somehow downgraded because of immigration and they feel shame of not protecting their national pride, etc. And then the shame put on the immigrants, you don't belong, you are not good enough. And that can actually escalate violent conflicts. That the basis of it is really shame. And to go to your point, definitely make people feel somehow not worthy is an attempt to discourage them from trying to blend in or to assimilate, because lots of people see multiculturalism as a genuine threat to their coherent community, and making someone feel not safe is an attempt to don't even try to settle.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. You've just given me so much to think about. I hadn't really thought about the shame angle, but it makes so much sense at the individual and at the collective level to be looking at that. And shame, no good. Don't feel it.
And that is a very good conclusion. Despite it is a universal emotion, you can give it back. If someone wants to make you feel ashamed, you can just say, no, this is not for me. This is a parcel that arrived at the wrong address. Just take it back. I'm not taking it. And that is the only way to survive. Well, survive to thrive.
Thrive we shall indeed. Maybe not in 2020, surviving is okay right now, but soon enough, we'll thrive. What Marcela brought home for me is the incredible danger of internalizing xenophobia and how it limits us in our own minds, in our expectations of what we can achieve and of what we should demand of ourselves and of others. I stand in awe and in eternal gratitude to people willing to open up their lives and share such intimate details with a nosy podcaster like me. So a huge thank you to Marcela Kunova. This was not a quid pro quo, but incidentally, I also recently spoke on the podcast that she edits, hosted by Jacob Granger. So if you want to listen to it, just look for the journalism.co.uk podcast on your usual platform, or find the link in the show notes. If you too would like to come on to Borderline, if you have topics you'd like me to cover, ideas for guests that I should invite, please do reach out. Honestly, that's the hardest part of the job, and I'm always looking and open to recommendations. Reach out. I'm easy to find on all the social media or on borderlinepod.com, where you'll find my email. Remember, you can support Borderline by becoming a member. I am looking for at least 11 people to get my accounts from red to green by Christmas, which is appropriately seasonal. So join now on borderlinepod.com or look for Borderline on Patreon, and you'll get your Christmas care package. Remember to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and also to rate and review and share the podcast with your friends. It really helps me to grow the audience. And sign up for the newsletter. It comes out once or twice a week with a lot more goodness than I can fit into the podcast. I'm your host, Isabelle Hogol, and this was Borderline. Music by Diala. I'll talk to you soon.